our car. Oh, Jesus! Oh, you big skin! She's feeling me fucking skin!
Hey, just before we get to the video, I just want to say thank you for coming on. And please consider liking this video if you enjoy it. Comment below if, say, you find something wrong or you just want to say good job. In any case, please consider subscribing to my channel. And if you're really dedicated as a fan, ring that bell. It'll notify you anytime new videos are up. And I hope you enjoyed this video. Hello and welcome to I Can't Believe It's Not the Mouse, the podcast all about animated features not made by Disney. I'm your host, Octaviano, and today, this episode is going to air right before the 4th of July, so I figured let's do an episode focused on a 4th of July movie. Now, last year, before I officially started this podcast, I did do an episode on America the Motion Picture, the Netflix feature, that was pretty much like a test for what I ended up doing. And I figured, okay, you know what, for this new, official episode, first official episode for 4th of July, I figured I should do something that, of course, focuses on the holiday and is probably also adult. Well, not probably, is adult. Now, when it comes to animation, of course, a lot of people have this stigma around it where they consider it to be a family-friendly thing, a child-only thing, a thing that if adults are watching it, it's because they're watching it with their kids. And honestly, that's lame. So it is nice to see every now and then animated features that are pretty much just determined to say, hey, animation can be for adults too. The downside is that, of course, we haven't had that many, and because we have so few of them, a lot of them often tend to try very hard on creating that image for people. Like, they often try to force in adult jokes, adult content in there, and it gets to a point where it gets kind of annoying. So with that in mind, I figured, okay, let me go back to one that I really enjoyed, but has since become kind of hated online. Like, I often see a lot of negativity towards, and see whether or not I, feel a bit different now than I did when it first came out, which is Sausage Party, the 2016 animated feature from Seth Rogen that, it's very adult. And gotta be honest, I do have some issues with it. Mainly that, yes, it is another feature that tries very hard to be for adults in terms of sometimes some of the characters will say things that just feel like no one talks that way. Especially like when it comes to like where it was most jarring for me, at least, was when it came to some of the supermarket workers where they would just start swearing in front of the customers, and not like in a way where it's like it felt natural, in a way where it just felt like, okay, this movie is just trying to have the characters, say fuck and shit and stuff like that. It doesn't have to happen too often, but it does happen enough where I'm like, people don't talk that way, especially if they're working there. And, I wouldn't notice so much except that it's not funny jokes, it's not funny lines or anything like that, so it's kind of like, this is just awkward. But thankfully, that's so small in the movie that it honestly does not matter. The movie works well because it is a very well told story. It's just a very clever, funny movie. And it's a parody of Pixar movies. I mean, you can see, of course, that the movie is lampooning other stuff, but for the most part, it's largely Pixar movies. So I gotta be honest, for those of you who maybe came into this thinking that I was gonna tear a new one on Sausage Party, or just expected something more negative, since I know it has garnered that kind of reputation. Sorry, but I really did enjoy this movie. I enjoyed it back when it came out, and I enjoy it more so now, watching it again and seeing the reactions that it gets from people online. Like, don't get me wrong, I get it. It is annoying to see animated features trying very hard to be adults and whatnot, but, if I'm completely honest, when it works, the movie really works, and it works more often than it doesn't. But for those of you who have never heard of the movie, it's basically, like I said, it's pretty much a parody of Pixar movies. In Pixar we know that toys come to life when no one's looking. Monsters, are at work whenever they're going into our closets to scare us. It's all of those things that you would normally expect from these kinds of movies, but instead it's food, and because it's food, it kind of takes a pretty obvious but necessary dark turn for what essentially is like, hey, what if we took a lot of those Pixar movies and went with the darkest extreme for them? Because, of course, when it comes to Pixar movies, like, Toy Story, of course, is the most known one, where the toys are pretty much worshipping the humans. They're like, oh, they're the people who play with us. They, enjoy us. Before this came out, one of the more recent Pixar movies at the time was Inside Out, which was, of course, about emotions, who, of course, build people. And, with that, it's like, okay, we're focused on the person that we're in to basically make sure that they're as perfect as they need to be. That is played around with here because it's sort of like, all these food worshipping humans, they call them gods, so they're not even bullshitting on it. And they're pretty much like, okay, so there's a really catchy song done by Alan Menken, of all people, who most of you will know as the guy who does the music for a lot of the classic Disney movies from like the 90s and whatnot. And it's all about these, the food basically worshipping people. It's like, oh, if we, praise the gods here, we'll eventually go into the promised land, we'll do a lot of great things, we'll bathe in glory, and realistically the food don't shy away from it. They acknowledge we're gonna fuck a lot. And in that way, it kind of, feels like, okay, so this is definitely taking an aim at religion. Of course, it's not that it's even being subtle about it. It literally mentions stuff like beliefs, and of course, the fact that characters consider the humans to be gods. It's very obvious what it's lampooning, but of course, it's fun because you realize, like, okay, this is really like an extreme take on what we would normally see from Pixar movies, and it doesn't let up. Like, it of course goes all in on it. Again, I can understand that some people might not be too into the fact that the characters are pretty much all horny dipshits, but it's like, I mean, realistically speaking, how many religions often tie sex with either like the afterlife or as a thing that you are supposed to get out of doing like the right things? Like, oh, you're supposed to wait until marriage and then that's when you get to make love with your wife. But of course they try to still add in like, oh, that's so you can get kids. But it's one of those things where it's like, it's encouraging you to have lots of kids, so it's encouraging you to fuck a lot. These religions are very sexual, and of course not to say that, oh, if you're religious you're a horny dipshit. It's just a lot of it does seem to kind of tie into it if you look at it, and I love that the movie kind of plays around with that. But again, it just does not let up. The whole movie is pretty much all on this, and of course you have the main character who's voiced by Seth Rogen. He's a sausage named Frank, who's in love with a bun named Brenda, played by Kristen Wiig. And pretty much what it is he's already having doubts about like the whole belief, but he's like, whatever, I'm in love with this girl and I want to be with her, which that all gets thrown away the second a returned honey mustard comes into the picture, into the cart that they're in when they're about to be purchased, and basically starts saying like, no, you guys are all fucking wrong. You guys are going into your deaths if you're going with the gods, so forget this. Of course, Frank, who's already having doubts, starts considering his words, especially as he mentions like, oh yeah, there's some other people in this superstore that are aware of like, what's the truth, but don't seem to want to tell anyone else. So one thing leads to another. The Seth Rogen and Kristen Wiig characters get knocked out of the basket, and that results in what is most of the story. And of course, this is a typical Pixar thing where they're supposed to return to their owls just so they can get back in time before the ticking time clock, which is, as they call it, Red, White, and Blue Day or 4th of July, and go back to their afterlife or whatever. Along the way, they get sidekicks with a bagel and a lavash. The lavash I believe it's David Krumholtz who's voicing him, and then the bagel is voiced by Edward Norton, and it's a really good voice performance. Very stereotypical on that, and I'll get into the stereotypes in a bit, but for the most part, I get why that might be a problem with some people, but I gotta be honest, the movie is acknowledging it in a way where it's like, I get why this could be seen as racist, but for the most part, it's done well. So yeah, that is a good chunk of the movie, them trying to go back to their essentially home so they can go off and be happy. Of course, you have the wrench in there with Frank having doubts and now having heard it from someone, so further confirming that he may be onto something. Decides like, okay, while we're going home, we're gonna maybe take a detour and, maybe encounter the characters that the Honey Mustard mentioned, which was a firewater, and this leads to a whole thing with non-perishable characters, Twinkies, Grits, and stuff like that, who know a lot more than what's going on. And for the most part, that is the majority of the movie. You do get a little subplot, or one of the sausages that was taken, who was a friend of Seth Rogen's character, played by Michael Cera. Shoot, I'm forgetting his name. Barry was his name. Who's like this little deformed sausage who actually witnesses like, okay, yeah, so it turns out that the humans are killing us and, eating us. And again, it's really great stuff. Like, it's the kind of thing where I'm like, I don't know, isolated, I would have imagined that without the language, this would probably still get it like a PG rating, but with the language, it definitely goes for a hard R, and it kind of makes sense because the kills in this are brutal, even though it's essentially just food, like, oh, they chop up the hot dogs, they're melting the cheese on the chips, the potato gets, skinned alive, it's all that kind of funny stuff, but it does go into this whole thing where the characters are swearing a lot, and for the most part, I get why some people might be having issues with it, but I'm like, a lot of this doesn't feel forced. Like I said, there are some that do feel forced, but the food swearing, not so much, just because, one, we're already established they're horny as shit, but two, the more important thing is that when they're swearing when it's saying the truth, it's like, well, yeah, I mean, if you saw this giant massacre, you would probably lose your shit too, so that stuff is always funny. And again, for the most part, the bulk of the plot is the Frank's character going back home, but using it as an excuse to find out the truth of what's going on. He of course encounters the non-perishable items, which is kind of funny because you got like the Grits character and the Firewater character, who are both stereotypes. Again, I'll be getting into that. You have the Twinkie character, who's also kind of a stereotype. Twink, figure it out. But the other two, what's funny about them is like you have like the whole Native American stereotype and the black stereotype. And they both hate crackers, the food, but of course what the joke is there. And they of course explain like, okay, yeah, we actually just created the song that you guys sing all the time. We created the whole vision of the aftermath because we saw how a lot of people were suffering, and while we were able to escape it because we're non-perishable, a lot of other items here aren't, and there's only so much they can do. So rather than constantly hear them crying, we decided like, okay, well, make them happy about what's gonna happen, make them think that it's gonna be something positive, just so it makes it easier for people to handle, and just so we don't have constant mass panic, because I would imagine that would be very harsh. And I will say this much, I do love the animation that they use when they explain this, because it goes into 2D briefly and it feels like 50 style cartoons. The animation on this is okay. It's very cheap. It's noticeably cheap, and well, it's not the worst I've ever seen. It's not exactly great. Sometimes, I don't know if it's supposed to be a joke or not, you see like the characters just flailing their arms all over the place, and it's just like, why are they animated that way? It's just weird. Yeah, for the most part, it's very fun. Well done animation. I mean, for the most part, since the characters are just food, you don't have to rely on having super detail. It's just, as long as you get it across, it's fine. And sometimes, even though they're massacring all these characters, it is kind of like, fuck, I kind of want to get some food right now. But yeah, for the most part, moving aside from the food, moving aside from the language, I will say that yes, there are a lot of stereotypes in this movie. I mean, really badly. Like, within the opening minutes, you get, like, the Chinese food talking very stereotypically Chinese, like, with a heavy accent. You get, stuff like that. And it's like, I get why this should be offensive. Like, there's even at some point where they go into, like, the Mexican food aisle, and they introduce another character that comes along for the adventure, which is a character voiced by Salma Hayek, called Teresa the Taco. She's a lesbian taco who's horny. And I get why some people might not appreciate the stereotypes in there, but again, it kind of feels like it works in the story's favor, especially given the subject, because it's like, yeah, a lot of food tends to have like personalities or, culture, projected onto it. Like, whether it's like in the product itself, like, if you've ever had like Tapatio, yeah, like the little icon in there, which is a bearded Mexican man, and it's like, this thing looks kind of stereotypical. A lot of Chinese food, because we like to emphasize the culture, becomes like very much like a product of like Chinese, like a Chinese looking thing, where it's basically like, yeah, this feels, if it wasn't for the fact that this was food and was intentionally made this way just to kind of show it off, it kind of feels racist. I mean, we got Uncle Ben, Aunt Jemima, all this stuff where I'm like, again, you can complain about this movie being racist, but at the same time, look at what's actually on the store shelves and tell me that we aren't actually there with a lot of this stuff. Which is why I'm mostly okay with that, because it's like, yeah, this is uncomfortable. I'm not denying that, but it feels like we kind of have to address it, especially when we see it up front. And it's like, if you're going to be grafting personalities on these, and like, let's be real here, this is again another Pixar thing where, like, whether it's like the toys or whatnot are grafted personalities onto in their movies, and it's usually reflective of whatever they are. I mean, with Cars, we literally had like the cars being based off like, oh, this is a car that's normally used by hippies, so let's make it a hippie car. Ramon is a lowrider, so he's very Hispanic. And again, not to say that it goes full on racist with that, but it is to a point where it's like, it can be kind of questionable, and if you're going to take it to an extreme, especially with a parody, it makes sense to go with that. So I have no problem with it. I understand if some people, don't like that, but for the most part, I don't have a problem with it. To me, at least, that's at least a more understandable complaint than I don't like the language. I don't know. When it comes to a lot of people, I get why they don't like how a lot of adult animated features try to force in the adult aspects of it, but you have to understand that since this is a very, a very misunderstood medium and entertainment, like, a lot of people do still try to associate it with kids, even when it's very clear that it's not. Like, thinking about Pixar movies throughout this entire thing, most of them work well at, if you're an adult, especially if you look at the metaphors, they work very well. Like Toy Story, whether it's 1, 2, 3, even 4, yeah, kids can watch it, kids can enjoy it. But if you want the most out of it, if you want like the metaphors in the movie to actually hit hard, you're gonna have to be an adult. It's not a very simple thing for kids to grasp, like this whole idea of like an adult who basically wants to spend more time, with a kid who's now focused on another toy, or in reality, it would be more like a kid who maybe now is more inspired by like a teacher than they are by their own father. That's the way I kind of interpreted that. Or in the case of like the last Toy Story, where it was literally like a father who's already done with his kid and he's maybe taking care of another kid, like let's say like his grandkid or something like that. But, he has to choose that or go back with the person he loves, because the grandkid realistically has other people that are looking after them, or I don't know. It's not perfect, and I'm not really here to talk about that. The point is that you can kind of see where these things make more sense for an adult, and because of that, it's like, yeah, these movies, even if they don't have all these swears or whatnot, they work as adult features. But because of that, because a lot of people don't see it that way, they often are like, okay, well, we gotta make it more adult by adding in all these things, and I can't blame him. I mean, that's what some people ask for when they say like, oh, if it's gonna be adult, it has to have the language, it has to have the blood, it has to have all that stuff. So I get it from that regard. I know it can be annoying, especially if they just force it in, but for the most part, seeing people complain about it with this movie, it's like, I don't know, did you actually watch the movie, or are you just going by what you assume the movie is? Because, again, while some of it is definitely forced, and I will say that stuff is weak, for the most part, it's like, most of it definitely works, and most of it does feel right in this movie. Going beyond that, like, it's just a very funny movie. It's very silly. I like that the villain in this movie is a literal douche. It's a douche who acts like a douche. Nick Kroll, who's easily the best vocal performance in this movie, just because, one, it's a really great voice for the character. I like the lines that he's given. I like that there's a running gag where anytime he mentions like a certain thing, like, like the way a jock douchey guy would say like, turn up the beat, and then a beat pops up and it's like, hey, were you talking about me? You get a lot of that throughout the whole movie, and it's just very funny because it eventually leads into a Ratatouille parody with him. And I mean, I don't want to really spoil it for anyone who's never seen this movie, but it's a douche. If you know what douches do, you probably figured out where exactly he does his own little version of Ratatouille, where controlling humans with his hands. So trust me, it's funny. And yeah, it's just a very clever movie. I like how it, of course, is satirizing Pixar. I don't know. Think about animation in terms of the comedy ones. Has there ever been one that fully lampoons another animation studio or style beyond this movie? I feel like this is probably like the only movie where it's like it's an animated parody that what its subject is specifically something else that's animated, so it makes sense for it to be the way it is. Because again, that's another reason why I don't mind a lot of the adult stuff in here, because it's like, well, it is a parody of Pixar movies, so if you're gonna lampoon it, and especially want to do it in a way where it's like, okay, look, a lot of people who watch these movies are now adults, let's just cut the bullshit and just say, like, if you look at it from a certain perspective, if you take their concepts to their extreme, you realize it's really fucking dark. It's pretty much like these things are worshipping people in a religious way, and considering how bad some things can be, yeah, it can be pretty bad. So, I don't know. I love it for all those reasons. For the most part, really great movie. Really funny movie. I don't know. I highly recommend it. Like, if you're the kind of person who gets easily offended by, language and whatnot, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I get it. Some, people have their own limitations. This movie might not be for you, but if you're willing to, like, look at it, our cartoon and just be like, let's take the piss out of, a known company like Pixar. You don't mind the language, if you're into like adult comedy shows like Family Guy, Rick and Morty, a lot of the Adult Swim stuff, you'll get a lot of mileage out of this. I mean, personally, I'm a big fan of a lot of Seth Rogen's movies. I think the ones that he tends to write and, act in are normally pretty funny. So for me, this was kind of a sold, the second it came out. And realistically, since I don't know, it's not that big of a deal, but if a lot of you remember that whole leak that Sony had years ago because of another Seth Rogen movie, The Interview, the North Korean comedy movie, you'll know that this movie got leaked, at least scripted, a few years before it even came out. I remember reading it. It's kind of rough, but for the most part, it's what you get out of this movie, and it's still pretty funny. I think the end result is the funniest thing in the whole movie, and for the most part, I do love how the movie ends as a further way of, like, yes, we're taking this whole metaphor all the way with the characters essentially realizing, like, okay, so it's not just the gods in this world that we have to kill, because by the end of the movie, they're pretty much like, yeah, we gotta kill people, and it's really great. The carnage is great. They realize, like, okay, there's one extra level above the people that are here that we're dealing with, and I guess spoiler alert, whatever, this movie came out years ago. It turns out that they're going into the real world. Like, they've acknowledged, like, hey, Frank, you're voiced by a guy named Seth Rogen. Hey, Sammy Bagel, you're voiced by Ed Norton, and he even insults himself. It's great. Yeah, it's just an all around really funny movie. I think it was really great. I understand there was some controversy based on how they underpaid workers, which sucks. I'm not going to deny that. It definitely sucks. I kind of feel like that might have derailed a lot of the conversation this movie had, because I know it was a pretty big hit when it came out, but once that the news broke out on that, it kind of lost a lot of the goodwill that it had. And I'm not sure if that's a big reason why the internet's kind of turned on this movie. I get it. There's a lot of movies that really need to pay their workers better, and without a doubt that's understandable. And if you're mad at it for that reason, I get it. It makes sense. Me personally, I'm just like, okay, that sucks, but I'm not going to deny that the end product is still a really funny movie, if for nothing else, because one of the things I learned about it was that Salma Hayek, who plays, of course, the Taco character, was apparently very confused and uncomfortable with a lot of what she was saying. Like, not to a point where she didn't like working on it, but she was like, okay, look, Edward Norton, told me like, hey, you should come along and I'll play a role on this. It's very fun. And then realizing it, it's one of those kinds of movies. It's not just a simple kids movie. So I don't know. That's very funny to just visualize just that the reactions of like her seeing her horny character and being like, okay. I don't know. Beyond that, I think it's just a really solid movie, and it's definitely worth watching, especially if you're gonna watch it for 4th of July. But realistically, you don't even have to watch it for that. The movie does not lean too hard on the holiday, and if I'm talking about it now, it's just because it happens to take place on the holiday, so I figured like, hey, that's a fun one to look at. It's there enough so that you know what it's focusing on, but it's not the whole thing in the movie. Like, it's not gonna turn into a whole America metaphor, at least not entirely, but whatever. But yeah, thank you for listening. I hope to see you again next time, and have a great holiday.
What did he do to you?
You don't wanna fucking know.
Thank you for coming on and listening to me today. If you enjoyed it, you can always subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can follow my podcast. It's on Podbean, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. And if you want to support me even more, there's always the option of Patreon. Patreon is a great way to support artists. And with that, you can always put in $1 or even more. It's all up to you. All just to help produce the show and other things I may do. Thank you again, and I hope to see you in the coming future.